Joining me now is the Chair of the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, Kathy Fox. Ms. Fox, thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Can we start with one of the overriding concerns you outline in this report is fatigue. And you do say that fatigue is a wide and a huge issue. Explain how it applies and what your concerns are.
Well, we introduced fatigue on the TSP watch list in 2016 for railway freight crews because we'd had a number of investigations where fatigue had been a contributing or risk factor, and their schedules in particular are somewhat unpredictable. They're often operating overnight, etc. This year, when we looked at updating our watch list, we had some additional accidents involving fatigue in the marine industry as well as in the air industry. And so we recognize that fatigue is really a pervasive issue in society, and particularly in a 24/7 transportation industry.
Is it getting any better? Because you mentioned it in the 2016 report, watch list. Is it getting worse?
Well, with respect to fatigue in rail, that remains on the watch list. We've added aviation and marine. Okay. So the actions we were hoping to see in rail haven't taken place yet. And what we found is that the three modes of transportation are at different points in the journey in having effective fatigue management. Okay. So aviation has prescriptive duty regulations for pilots, but Transport Canada has been trying to update them to make them more representative of international standards and modern fatigue science, but that's taking a lot of time, so we want to encourage them to move forward with that. On the marine side, we had the accident out west involving the Nathan Stewart tug that capsized and spilled oil, and the watchkeeper fell asleep. He was alone on duty and fell asleep, missed a planned course correction. So each of those modes has different operational considerations, but we think that employees need to have good fatigue management awareness training so they can take steps to improve sleep and also to mitigate the effects of fatigue. Employers need to have fatigue management plans, and Transport Canada needs to hold the industry to account in terms of good regulations.
In terms of the rail, you said you'd asked the rail to get better fatigue management techniques. Have they? Because I've heard reports, but they don't stick in my mind right now.
Well, what we're seeing is the railway industry is required to provide fatigue management plans to Transport Canada. We ask that Transport Canada review those plans, make sure that they're based on sound fatigue science, and a lot of it too has to be negotiated with the union. So it's really an issue that involves a shared responsibility between Transport Canada as the regulator, but also the operators, the unions, and the employees themselves.
You mentioned the pilots. I know I've heard in recent weeks and months, the Pilots Association here in Canada, I guess it's about its union, saying that they're concerned that there'll be a watering down. There'll be longer shifts and less control of fatigue management if some proposals are accepted. They're saying there's international pressure to have longer and more work.
Well, I think if we're talking about aviation, those pilots, in fact, our regulations in Canada are a little less stringent than some of the international standards or some standards applied in other countries. And recently we had the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board that investigated the Air Canada incident in San Francisco. They cited fatigue as a factor there, and they've made a recommendation to Transport to review their duty regulations with respect to reserve pilots, who particularly those who are working into the over the overnight period and into the period of what's called a circadian low, when their performance is naturally going to be reduced due to fatigue. Okay,
let's talk about something you also recommend. You draw attention to the question of rail safety indicators not being followed or not being obvious. What's the problem there?
So the railway system in Canada works on a series of visual signals, and the locomotive engineers and conductors are required to observe those signals, to interpret them, and then to act upon them. And those signals help to determine speeds as well as operating limitations within which the train can operate. And what we found about 33 times a year, which is a small number when you compare to the total number of train operations, but about 33 times a year, those signals are either misperceived or they're not followed, and a train goes through a signal, and that can lead to a derailment or a collision with another train, and that was at the heart of the Via Rail derailment in Burlington back in 2012. So we believe that there needs to be 4 physical defenses to help the train crew observe, perceive the signals, and also slow the train down or even stop it if they don't follow the signal.
Are you getting any action on that?
It's very slow. The Canadian industry and Transport Canada is sort of in study mode right now. Now, this is going to be a requirement in the United States, but the United States has had things like in-cab signaling, where the signals are actually projected inside the cab as opposed to looking out the window at them. And they also already have some automated systems that can slow or stop a train if a locomotive engineer goes past a signal. We don't have any of that in Canada yet.
Okay. You also point to runways. Some issues on runways with planes, obviously. What's the issue there?
So there are two issues. One is runway overrun. So if you think back to Air France that went off the end of runway 24 left in Toronto in 2005, Canada does not meet the international standard for runway and safety areas. That's just an area which is clear and graded and free of obstacles to reduce the risk of injury or death or damage to the aircraft. And so we want Transport Canada to implement at the very least the international standard of 150 meters, preferably the international recommended practice of 300 meters to reduce the risk of those types of accidents. The other issue is the risk of collision on runways, and that's between an aircraft and another aircraft or a vehicle. We believe that more can be done in terms of procedures, airport signage, as well as technical direct-to-pilot warning systems. And I might add, these are not just Transport Canada issues. These are issues that the industry can take action without waiting for regulations. And so whether
airport
it's
authorities as well.
Exactly. Yeah, we'd like to see airport authorities, for example, take look at the risk of aircraft running off the end of their runways and take action.
I have to ask you a last question, and that is because a lot of people, if they recognize your face, it's because you also were involved in reports concerned with rail safety and specifically with the transport of flammable materials by rail. And we're thinking Lac Mégantic and that disaster there. You are, in this watch list, you're taking off the watch list, you're removing it from the watch list, concerns about transport of flammable materials by rail. Why are you taking it off the watch list?
We put this issue on the watch list in the immediate aftermath of Lac Mégantic in 2014. We carried it through 2016. We were looking for two specific things. We wanted the railway industry to take better steps to manage the risk of transporting flammable liquids, and we wanted those liquids transported in more robust tank cars. Those actions have been taken, therefore we can take it off the watch list. But that being said, the TSB still has a number of recommendations that are outstanding that will reduce the risk, 3 of them from the Lac Mégantic accident and 2 from some accidents that occurred up in Northern Ontario. So we're going to continue to push the issue through our outstanding recommendations.
That's what I was going to say, because that doesn't mean that you're no longer paying attention to that, because I had an author here 2 weeks ago talking about how there still are derailments that are causing ruptures of tank cars and things like that.
Absolutely, this remains on our radar, but we felt that because the actions have been taken, once they've been taken, we remove them from the watch list. But there are still other issues that need to be addressed with respect to safe transportation of flammable liquids by rail.
Okay, Ms. Fox, I want to thank you very much, and we'll follow up on a lot of these issues, and I thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you very much.